You're listening to Backbench Drivers. I'm your host, John Lawson, and joining me this week, as always, we've got my co-host, Matthew Fisher.
Hey everyone, how you going?
We're back this week after having a couple of stuff-ups. We did record a full episode giving our predictions about the upcoming federal election, and tragically, only one person, aside from Matthew and myself, will ever hear that because the recording software didn't work. We only had one member that was listening live at the time, so it's stored in his memory and nowhere else. Tragically, but this week we're returning strong. We've got a guest that I am extremely excited to talk to. I think it's Dr. or Professor Stephen McInerney. He's
McInerney.
joining us this week. Oh, McInerney, sorry, my bad.
McInerney, that's right. It's
I
Irish.
recently, Irish, yeah, the dastardly Irish tripping me up all the time with their names. But he's joining me this week after recently he did a awesome podcast with Dan, and I've forgotten his name again, but he's from NatCon Australia. And you two did a fascinating episode together. So I reckoned I just had to get you on the podcast. So welcome on, Stephen. Would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself, your politics, your background, and what you do for work?
Yeah, thanks for having me, John and Matthew. It's nice to be here. I'm Stephen McInerney. I'm an academic. I teach at Campion College, Australia, where I've been since 2006. From 2017 to 2021, I was on the executive of the Ramsay Centre for Western Civilization in Sydney during a hiatus from Campion. I'm a writer, a poet, and I focus in my scholarly work on poetry, particularly some Australian poets, Les Murray in particular, but also Gerard Manley Hopkins and the Anglo-Welsh poet and modernist David Jones. So that's a little bit about me. I was born in 1976, so I'm coming up to my 50th birthday next year. I grew up in Kiama on the south coast. I went to school in Sydney, to boarding school. Then I went to the ANU, travelled a bit, started my PhD and spent time in a monastery in between all that, and came to Campion in 2006.
Some insane dad lore right there.
Yeah, quite the story. Well, we're very glad to have you here, and I guess it's a very recent development that you've sort of come onto the online space, it seems, at least to my view. And just before we hit record, unfortunately for the audience listening, we were having a great discussion, but you were telling me a little bit about your intellectual journey and what led you to speak out. Would you like to dive into that just a little bit?
Yeah, sure. It seems to have happened all of a sudden, in recent times that I've been more public with my views about, ethnicity and the composition of Australia and the direction of Australia. But I suppose I first started focusing on this issue personally about 10 years ago when I noticed increasing demographic changes in my surrounding suburbs. I live in the eastern suburbs of Sydney. And it was the first time I'd ever been in a situation where I'd be in parts of Sydney and was in a minority. And it was really the first time in my life apart from when I was a kid and we'd go to, Chinatown, where you're deliberately going for that experience, suddenly I was finding my suburb was being transformed and I was uncomfortable with that. And I started to wonder why I was uncomfortable with it. I didn't have anything particularly against the people that were there, but I felt uneasy with it, and I just wanted to understand my own feelings. And I started to, talk to my family about it, talk to meaning my wife and other people, some friends, and tease out some issues and read some books. But I'm married to a Greek Australian, and I became very aware of how ethnocentric, legitimately, Greeks are. And then I started to realize, in fact, every ethnic group is very ethnocentric, except it seems my own. And I was curious about that. And with my my work from 2017 to 2021, I encountered a lot of what I would call anti-whiteism. That is, the Ramsay Centre was attacked as racist and white supremacist and all of this. And I was wanting to know what all of that meant, given that what we were doing was promoting Western civilization, which is essentially European civilization in its different forms around the world, in Europe, Britain, and elsewhere in places that have been colonized and settled by Europeans. And then I started to think back over my own time as a student at university and studying Australian literature, and why was there a kind of critique, a fairly vigorous, rigorous, persistent critique of what it was to be Australian, and the kind of anti-white thing developing there, which didn't seem particularly serious. It didn't seem to threaten us in any real way. But I came to see that culture wars are real wars, and that they have real victims. And although I don't like, adopting a victim mentality, I started to realise, well, this is really challenging the very basis of the existence of Australians as a people, and I mean ethnic Australians, people descended from the British Isles and from Europe beyond that. The group, the ethnicity that was formed here for about 200 years, and formed in a very deliberate and self-conscious way, protected by policy, the White Australia policy and so on, that whole, my people was being delegitimised. And I wanted to know why that was. And then, a few months ago, I just decided, coming up to 50, I needed to actually start really thinking about this in a serious intellectual way, and putting my views forward.
That's sort of what we wanted to focus on a little bit today, that topic you mentioned at the end, the formation of the Australian ethnos, or the ethnic group, which is sort of still debated whether Australians are a distinct ethnicity, whether we're just British people in Australia, whether we're, European, in a broader sense, or whatnot. That's something I really want to dive into with you.
Yeah.
But first, I suppose it's worth tackling what you mentioned, with culture wars being real wars and the real consequences of those. And I suppose we recently, well, not so recently now, but we did an episode in which we spoke about the violent murder of this lovely old granny up in Queensland. And for some reason, this particular case sticks with me, of the murder of this woman, Vilene White. She was murdered because, for no reason, she was murdered by some African teens who took her car keys when she offered them, and then killed her anyway, when they robbed her. And so I see this as something that would have been prevented very simply. This and many similar attacks, and many attacks which will come in the future, which could have been prevented had the for lack of a better term, white right, or sort of pro-white Australian right, won in the culture war that took place in the end of the 20th century, and has been completely swept away going into the 21st century, barely even exists today, completely delegitimized culturally, has no backing, and is not even really a valid. It's not an ideology that's even really allowed by the state these days. There have been various laws, especially in recent months, that have been put in to criminalize some expressions of pro-white sentiment, whether that's symbols, and various other laws that ban speech even. So yeah, you're absolutely right. There are legitimate reasons why we need to really push back against these ideas. It's not for our own vanity. It's not because hurt feelings or something like that. There are real consequences of anti-white ideology, and they become ingrained in policy, and then you have consequences like the murder of many white people by people that never would have been in the country otherwise. And we can predictably say have higher crime rates, are more prone to violence of certain types. Now that's a little bit controversial, maybe. I don't want to get you in too much trouble, Stephen. I'm not sure what you're comfortable with discussing. But yeah, that's just one example. But of course, it extends to other domains such as same-sex marriage, and the whole culture that developed around love is love, and homosexual marriage and love being equal to that of heterosexual couples. Um, so there are various realms in which that plays out.
Yeah.
What you're saying, in which what you're saying is proven. But yeah, did you want to touch on that at all, or Matthew? Feel free to go ahead.
Look, I'm happy to respond unless
Yeah,
you wanted to
absolutely
come
go.
in, Matthew. But yeah, there's a lot in there in what you say to unpack. I mean, so obviously, uh, it can take extreme forms. What you've described, that if people are stirring up the idea that white is evil and white people are responsible for, as Les Murray said, all earthly plights. He was sending this up. Um, in one of his poems, a Brief History, that we're accused of being guilty of all earthly plights. Um, and, Susan Sontag infamously, notoriously said we're the cancer of the human race and so on. So, that can actually lead to violence. It can lead to violence against our monuments, but it can also lead to violence of the kind you've described. But before any of that, it also has, I suppose, a greater effect just on the culture around us. I was reading, if I give you some examples, I was reading the other day in the Sydney Morning Herald that, Swimming Australia and other organisations are worried because swimming carnivals are disappearing as a feature of Australian school life. And there's an article and everyone's thinking, why is this happening? And no one hits on what to me is the obvious reason, and that is that uh, demographically we are changing so rapidly that white Australians, that ethnic group, uh, who used to be 95% of people in schools, if not more, we were the ones who were interested in swimming carnivals. So as our numbers reduce and the school demographic changes and there's more Indians and Chinese and others, Muslims and others, well, they're not necessarily interested in elite swimming, and so swimming carnivals go. There's a school up the road from me that used to be a very good rugby school. I played against them as a schoolboy, and they used to, of course, be dominated by ethnic Australians, by white Australians. And now they're dominated by Chinese and Indians. The whole sporting culture of that school has vanished. So that has an effect on the old boys network and their feeling of connection to their old school, and the sense really that the school was one thing up until about, the year 2000 or 2010 even, and now it's a completely different thing, even though it's got the same name. And that to me is a kind of metaphor for what is happening to our country. So it's not that the people who are, as it were, have taken over that school are bad people or are doing anything wrong. That they were invited to come here and they want to go to a good school, so they do, and they're academically gifted and they end up getting all the places. But what happens is it obliterates the culture and the tradition of that school, so it's completely altered beyond recognition. Um, so culture wars have an effect in that way as well. Uh, Now, you mentioned that, the outcome of the culture wars that were being fought really take it all the way back to the 60s, um, is that, this poor woman is murdered in Queensland. And, it's reasonable to actually trace a line from one to the other. So what was actually going on? I mean, you can find videos of Sir Robert Menzies online where he's defending the White Australia policy, and he says what his fear is if we abandoned it. And he says that my fear is uh, that we would end up becoming like South Africa or the United States of America, or as he was saying this in, I think, the late 60s, I think he was no longer Prime Minister when he was being interviewed. And he says, or we could even go the way that Great Britain looks like it's going. So he knew that he didn't want that for Australia, and that was what his fear was. And he said he supported the White Australia policy, and it was the right policy to defend the national interest by defending the interest of the Australian ethnicity. and as he said, the homogenous society that we had. So it wasn't as if none of this was foreseen by wise heads. But, once he ceased to be Prime Minister, the Liberal Party changed position. The Labor Party, who under Arthur Calwell had been very staunch and up to him, been very staunchly in favour of it, started to change position such that by, under, I think, Harold Holt, officially the policy was just put to the side. But people that were born even 10 years after that, typically didn't notice the effects of that. I mean, I grew up in a very homogenous Australia, and now when I'm meeting Greeks or Chinese or other people, they'll say, "Oh, what's your background?" And if I simply say Australian, they say, "Oh, but we're Australian too." And I say, "Yeah, but what I'm talking about is the Australian ethnicity." And I think that's really interesting, is that new immigrants have been almost taught not to see the population that was here as in any sense uniquely responsible for having built the country that they came to. And in the interest of kind of saying that we are all Australian, they're allowed to emphasise their unique ethnic identity, but we're told really that we don't have one. And then, so McInerney's Irish, so you're Irish. I said, well, I'm Irish, but I've also got Dutch ancestry and I've also got Welsh ancestry. So, when I grew up, I didn't think of myself as any of those. I thought of myself as an Australian. So, that goes to your theme, I guess, of ethnogenesis. How does this unique Australian ethnicity come into being, and is it simply, are we simply just Brits, displaced or transplanted Brits, or are we a kind of unique flowering of a group of ethnicities from the British Isles and predominantly Northern Europeans, but also some Southern Europeans, over a 200-year period?
Yeah, I think interesting point you brought up is your generation grew up where you had a supermajority of Australians who saw themselves as Australians, whereas John and myself and most of our listeners are of a younger generation where we grew up in a divided country where you have ethnic enclaves, you have Australians saying they're 136 Aboriginal, so they're not white, or stuff like this. And there's this kind of crisis of identity in this country, which has pushed people either way, either hating white people or identifying heavily with Australian figures of the past.
Mm.
And I also want to talk about, you talked about getting rid of this Australian ethnic identity around white Australians being the historical population here, and that has coincided with a push towards quote-unquote Aboriginal recognition for land and ownership rights. Do you see these as two faces of the same coin, factors going alongside each other, or is there no real correlation between the two?
That's a big topic. I mean, it's interesting you raise it, because just today I was at Macquarie University. I was walking through Macquarie University, and most of the students that I was passing were, Asian, Chinese predominantly. And there were a few, white Australians, but most of the students were either foreign students or local students, but of Chinese ancestry. And as I was sort of looking around, I thought, isn't it interesting? There's a big sign over there. It's not put up by a student. It's part of the official university signage on these sliding doors. And the sign is, "White Australia has a black history." And I thought, what do the Chinese people walking past see here? Well, probably what they see is, oh, well, these white people must have been terrible, even though they invited me to their country. And so I'm perfectly entitled to disregard their contribution in building this country. Now, I'm not probably thinking too much into it, but I thought, isn't it interesting that a university is using some political messaging to denigrate white Australians, to delegitimise them really through clearly an unnuanced slogan. And what's the effect of this? Well, the effect of this is the few benighted white students that walk past, they sort of mope around and have to put their heads down, and the others can keep their heads held high knowing they don't have any part in this. And again, so there's a kind of little culture war going on right there. Now, are these things, is the voice to Parliament and so on part of this? Well, I think it was being used in that way. Yeah. And I think that's why it was good that people like Jacinta Price, who obviously has Indigenous heritage and Celtic heritage, why she campaigned against it. I think she saw that it was really being instrumentalised as part of this larger culture war to delegitimise white Australia, which, as she has said, she has in many ways benefited from. And she gave a poignant story, I won't repeat it now, but a poignant story in an address she gave to our students, talking about what it was that European civilization did for her mother to protect her from a very difficult set of personal circumstances that would have confronted her, namely childhood, marriage, were it not for the influence of European civilization. So it's a complex issue. I don't have any ill will towards Indigenous Australians at all. And there is obviously something sad and tragic about an Indigenous population, undergoing conquest. It doesn't mean necessarily that I feel that the conquest was illegitimate, however, or that it was anything other than inevitable. Had it not been the British Empire, it would have been the French or some other. So that it's a complex area, but to me, what our people have done here, we haven't simply come and lived as immigrants and lived on an island continent. We actually built a civilization, and within that civilization, we have tried to help, and I think have helped Indigenous Australians, many of whom are Christians, many of whom and most of whom now also share ethnic ties with us. So it's a complex area, that one.
Yeah, I don't know if we want to make that the main focus, because we have done a couple of episodes touching on that. But what I would like to go from there and move on to our next topic is the idea that we would begin sort of, I don't know if it's reigniting, but certainly bringing to the forefront this racial division within our consciousness. I mean, for the longest time, most Australians probably didn't really think about questions of race, especially towards the tail end of the 20th century, when Australia was 99% white at certain points, and that declined as the years went on, slowly and then precipitously. But it's only because I think we're being confronted in our daily lives with both the positive and negative effects of multiculturalism, that race is such, and background. You use the term background. So often you hear people say, "What's your background? What's your background?" It's a great way to introduce yourself, because so many people in Australia come from places that aren't Australia. It's a good way to just get a little bit of a connection with someone, see where they come from, what they might believe, or something like that. It's a great little introduction. And it's only really, I think it's a really good expression of what many are thinking, which is either subconsciously or consciously, which is I'm a increasingly a minority in Australia as a white person. I'm moving towards minority status. I'm surrounded every day at my work, on the train, in public, in the city, even sometimes in people's families as well, by people that aren't really very much like me. They've got completely different backgrounds from myself. They've got different belief systems, a different language. And So this has made the topic of race sort of it's headlined again. It's something that, like you said with Menzies, he was sort of trying to prevent it. It's a very British, I think, sort of part of our identity that we wouldn't want to make that conscious. It's a little bit it's always sort of been the way where it's acknowledged, but it wasn't sort of a primary identity, the whiteness of ourselves. I think Britishness and our customs and our religion, these were always sort of very much spoken about in public. The greatness of our civilization, our empire, um, but it wasn't always the case that race was really thought spoken about in polite society to the same degree. But it is increasingly becoming so among certain portions of the public who are confronted with diversity every day. And I
Yeah.
think that that sort of leads me on to the topic of ethnogenesis, which is first of all we should ask the question: have Australians become a unique ethnicity? And I'll throw that to you, Stephen, because I've got my own opinion. I personally think that yes, Australians are now a distinct ethnicity, and oftentimes, I guess they're referred to as Aussies, even by people that say yes, I'm Australian. If you tell them, oh yeah, he's an Aussie, they know what that means. They know that he comes from an Anglo-Celtic background. But probably he's been here for many generations. He knows no other country except for Australia. His family, for many generations, knows no other country apart from Australia as home. And so, uh, in that way, I'd say that yes, the proof of ethnogenesis is that we've become recognised as a people by outsiders and sort of by ourselves, insofar as we don't even think of race as a primary identity for the most part, or the people on this podcast might, but the average Aussie just thinks their primary identities are maybe their suburb, their footy team, what kind of beer they like. These are their, or, what TV show they watch. These are more so their primary identities. I think religion is still a pretty big one, but it's just taken for granted that they're at home here in Australia. And so I think that is in itself, although inconvenient, is proof of a successful ethnogenesis. But I've been talking for a second. I'll throw that to you, Stephen. What is your opinion? Have we undergone ethnogenesis? And if so, what does that mean for the Australian race? What does it mean the future's going to look like?
Yeah, there's definitely an Australian ethnos, and its roots are in essentially the British Isles. So, the first convicts, settlers, prison guards, everyone who came out here on the first fleet and the second fleet and so on, basically are from the British Isles. They arrive and they start fairly soon having children, and they're no longer fairly quickly, right? So I reckon you could say within the first 50 years, a new ethnic identity has basically been established. And so,
Well, to jump in there, sorry, I won't detail too much, but yeah, within one generation of children being born in Australia from convicts who originated from Britain, they noticed that the accent had begun to develop within one generation of living in
yeah,
Australia. But I won't interrupt. I'll throw it back to you.
no, that's right. So, a great book to read on this is Russell Ward's The Australian Legend. And I haven't looked at it until, the last few days. I haven't looked at it for 30 years. I read sections of it as an undergraduate. But I've come back to it, obviously, with fresh eyes and with a different perspective. But yeah, he has all sorts of primary sources that he's quoting from, as early as the 1820s and, certainly the 1830s and on, of people. So, other Brits would come out here to visit, and they would notice things, and they'd write letters home, and they'd keep diaries and so on. And they started to notice things. Well, the people that were born here, so they, were noticeably, of course, they've got British stock, but whether it was the environment, just being outside a lot, they actually ate a lot better in Australia, convicts included, especially the Irish, compared to what they were eating in England. And so they came up as a fairly robust looking people. You know, people commented on how they were taller than the English back at home. Their hair tended to be, I mean, as a type, not every individual, but, you know, it was remarked upon that, you know, often they had fair hair and blue eyes and so on. And as you say, people started to notice a distinctive accent. There were some people that even said that Australian children spoke better than most English children. So we often think about the Australian cringe comparing ourselves to the way we speak to the Queen's English or something as this kind of imperial, you know, overwhelming empire that's looking down on this little section of itself. But there were people actually saying young Australians speak very well. They've got a very attractive voice. They look very healthy and robust, and you know, that was commented on very early. So what happens? Well, why is that happening? I mean, obviously here, the English and the Scots and the few Welsh that we hear, Anglo-Welsh predominantly, and the Irish are mixing in a way that they really haven't mixed. The Scots and the English perhaps more so than the others, but they really haven't mixed, certainly not with that rapidity, that speed and intensity in a new environment ever before. So that's new. Obviously, racially, you know, they're all connected genetically, they're very similar, but different elements of each of those start to inform the Australian character. So there was a comment which I put on Twitter today by an observer who noticed that, you know, what the English contribute strength, the Irish contribute merriment, and the Scots, he said Scotch, the Scotch contribute keenness, meaning intellectual sharpness, and learning, right? So the Scots, there were few Scots amongst the convicts, but there are a lot of, well, increasingly there were Scottish free settlers and so on. Religion's important here. They had that Presbyterian Calvinist sort of work ethic. Most of them had come here deliberately. You know, they were coming here to get on in life, and they really advanced quickly. The Irish, why were they merry? Ward actually is intrigued by this. Why did people regard the Irish convicts and certainly their children as merry? And he has stories about a story about an Irish convict who had served her time, was sent back after she'd completed, or went back. She could have stayed, but decided to go back to Dublin. And when she got back, she deliberately committed a crime so she'd get sent back to Australia because she missed it. She missed Australia, and she was willing to serve another prison term in order to come back at
Well,
the
wouldn't we all,
expense
right?
at the expense of the crown. And then why are they merry? Because in Ireland they were not eating much meat. They were impoverished, and here the average Irishman had, you know, 3 square meals a day, meat 5 times a week. They loved it, and there was work. As soon as they were free, there was work everywhere. And, you know, the Irish were happy. They were happier here than they were in Ireland. So, and then they all start mixing together, you know, and as they become consciously a people, and, you know, there are examples of this, even not just amongst the convicts, but although the son of a convict, so Wentworth, he went back to England. I think he was in his mid-20s, and he studied at Peterhouse, Cambridge, and he entered a poetry competition, and they had to write a poem about Australia. And he actually talked in the poem about how much he missed his native land. So that was very early. You know, in other words, within a generation, some people, not all, started to see this as their land, and that they were, you know, yes, they're British and Irish. The Irish would have rejected the idea that they were British, and the British probably would have rejected the idea that the Irish were British. But in any case, they were all here, and that unique combination of ethnicities formed a new ethnicity. And when they looked to expand it, they thought, well, we've got to keep it within something that we recognise. So, immigration was opened up predominantly to people from Northern Europe. So Percy Stevenson, who was a sort of famous nationalist from the mid 20th century, his ancestry was Danish, and I think one of his parents was had Russian ancestry. So he didn't have any British ancestry, as far as I know. But he said that the people from Northern Europe, he meant the Danes in this case, they just assimilated more or less straight away. They learnt English and they saw themselves as Australian, and they were all mixing with the Anglo-Celts. So definitely something new, but also in continuity with European ancestors.
Yeah, exactly. And I guess we can talk a little bit about the timeline of ethnogenesis as well. What you were saying is, absolutely spot on. And I think I was rereading Percy Stevens' book again today, just in preparation for this topic. But yeah, what he's saying is absolutely correct, and what you're saying as well, in that we clearly are distinct, and people have, we are separate in some ways from the British. Not like I wouldn't say we're inseparably disconnected from them, but yeah, there are clearly unique elements of Australia. Even the fact that we have our own state, I think, is proof enough that we are a distinct outgrowth, that we wish to direct ourselves to some degree. And
Yeah,
that wasn't really present at the beginning, even at Federation. That even the most radical Australian nationalists at Federation were not in favour of a republic, at least not explicitly. That not at the
correct.
very time of Federation. The Federation fathers were unanimously monarchists. They a lot of them were Empire loyalists. I'd say a vast majority were Empire loyalists. And to this day, I think that still remains to some degree. Most people do feel some sort of an affinity for the mother country. Um, I mean, it's where we came
Yeah.
from.
Ward talks about this a little bit. He says the influence of the Irish was extensive, especially in New South Wales. And he said, whereas for the English, there was a pull in two directions between a kind of recognition that we are a new nation. And that was kind of intention. Like, how do we reconcile that? If you're English, how do you reconcile that? You're Australian, but you've predominantly English background. How do you reconcile that with you want to retain an attachment to the crown? Whereas the Irish, it was, we're a new people, we've got this new chance, and we're not really keen on being attached to the crown. So you see that later with figures like Ned Kelly, who have a very Irish-centric, focus and talk about the blight of the British and so on. So that's there. But what Ward says is that basically the Irish influence, their influence is so strong that it does kind of push us towards this sense of ourselves as an independent nation. But it's then countered by the other ethnicities that have kind of mixed up with the Irish in the Australian ethnos, or vice versa, however you want to see it, such that we become distinctive but remaining united to the crown. And yeah, it's a fascinating little dilemma, and you see these tensions play out later in with the formation of Bulletin magazine and so on. But in the lead up to Federation, it's clear to me that one of the key drivers for it was the fear that the independent states had, New South Wales and Victoria and others. Well, we want to keep the ethnic composition of our state, but what happens if another state doesn't want to keep theirs? That's eventually going to affect us. And so one way of avoiding that was to unite the states. So it's absolutely clear that the fathers of Federation wanted a united Australia for all sorts of reasons, but one of them was to protect the Australian ethnicity, the distinctiveness of it, and their recognition that more generally Europeans and Brits, let's just use Europe to cover it all, Europe and the British Isles, that on a world stage they're a minority. and that's one of the reasons. We think of minority politics, we think we're a majority at the moment and all these minorities. But in world historical and geopolitical, I don't like that phrase particularly, but geopolitical terms, we're actually a minority compared to populations of Africa and Asia and India and so on. We're not a supermajority on the world stage. We're a small group, and therefore we have an interest in actually protecting our distinctiveness.
And I mean, we often talk about these sorts of things in a historical context or in what can seem like a bit of an academic sort of way. But I guess if we sit back for a second, and if we were to respond to those who would say that the White Australia policy, which is what you're discussing, the Immigration Restriction Act of 1901, which was the specific legislation, which was the first piece of legislation passed by the Federated Australian Parliament, which I think demonstrates the primacy of it. If we sit back and respond to the critics for a second who say that this was a evil, a racist policy, well, I guess we have to ask them, what would you expect this tiny, tiny minority shot away from their native land,
Yeah.
disconnected, it takes at some points months and months for supplies to be delivered to them. Did you expect any sensible statesman trying to craft a new country in this environment to accept a diversity or an open borders immigration from the get-go or something like that? Is that in anyone's mind? Would that have been an intelligent way to set up a new state? I don't
Yeah.
think that it doesn't pass the pub test, to use
And would the Chinese,
a
if
sort of
they
a
had got here
colloquialism.
first, if the Chinese had got to
Absolutely.
Australia first and colonized it, would they have just opened it up to mass European immigration? Uh,
Oh no, of course not.
and so yeah, I've never found those sort of arguments convincing. I mean, they start off as a sort of moral argument, that there's something immoral about an ethnic group or a racial group seeing itself as a collective and wanting to work in its own interest. But that's what all groups do. That's why the Japanese have a very restricted immigration policy, and uh, even people that go and live in Japan and stay there all their lives, no one thinks of them as Japanese, even if they're fluent in Japanese and they've taken on the culture or aspects of Shintoism or whatever. No one thinks of them as Japanese. Um, so yeah, look, it's a funny double standard. That's all it is. And once you see it as a double standard, then it's a house of cards. It just falls down.
Well, it frees
So
you from that
I've
sort
said,
sort of moral guilt you sort of have imposed on you for being a pro-white
yeah.
person. And
Well,
yeah,
I've
once
said
you
to
realize, well, everyone else does it, it's fine.
yeah, no, and even like looking at, there's a national level, but even just on a sort of local level, I was talking to some Greeks and I said, trying to explain this to them. Um, so I didn't say, well, do you want Greece? Would you mind if Greece became German or Russian or African or whatever? Because they'd say, well, of course we don't want that, and no one would think that they should want that, right? Well, maybe some people now, but most sort of normal, responsible people would think that's a perfectly natural reaction that Greeks want to keep Greece Greek. But I didn't approach it at that level. I just said, well, the Greek church, most of the people in your church are Greek. Okay, you might accept some converts and whatever. Um, but would you be happy if I said to you, over the next 30 years, gradually, initially it'll be gradually, people will come in, let's say Africans, they'll start to be in your church, and then eventually in 15 years, they'll be half the church, and then by the 30-year period, you'll be a minority. Would you be happy about that? And they just say no. Like straight away, they just say no. And then they see my argument. So it's not a racist argument in any sense, except that ethnic groups and racial groups naturally want to cohere and be with their own kind. The same way when you travel, if I go to France, I like going there, but I don't feel as comfortable there as I do when I'm here. It's not because I hate French people, but I wouldn't necessarily be happy if Australia became French in the next 20 years. I might be happier than where it looks like it's going, but that isn't what I would choose for it, and that would be the same if you said would become majority Greek or even within Europe. Now, I would feel very differently if you said, Britain is being conquered and all the indigenous people from the British Isles are coming to Australia. That I would think would be great, because I know within a 10 or 20 year period, our numbers would burgeon, and it would be burgeoning the Australian ethnicity.
Yeah, exactly right. And I've left Matthew out of the conversation for a little while, so I'll put in my last couple of 2 cents and I'll throw to him. But people, especially what you're talking about with replacement, it's a controversial topic. But let's take an example from already in our history. If I was to say to a Chinese man who was offended by the administration of the White Australia policy, which did see Chinese miners and their families who did live in Australia for a time before Federation removed and sent back to China, I'd then have to ask them if they had any qualms about the Boxer Rebellion, which Australians did fight in. We did try to impose Western culture on China for a time, and I would say that it's perfectly reasonable for them to have then rejected that if that was their desire, and we can hardly hold that against them. I mean, we would say we're in favour of our own interests. I would have preferred if Australia administered China for our own sake, but I wouldn't have any sort of animosity against the Chinese man who had the opposite opinion. And so the same is true of replacement in this day and age. And like you gave with the example, everyone's a nationalist, but everyone's a nationalist for the people that they actually like. I stole that line from Twitter, but everyone's a nationalist for the people that they actually like. And that even goes for white people that are self-hating. Many times they'll be a nationalist for Aboriginals or for Palestine or something like that.
Yeah.
But everyone, at the end of the day, they like the people that they think are on their side or are their people. And that's not always ethnically defined. It can be ideological as well, or religious. But everyone's chauvinistic about that which they actually believe in. And to reject that specifically for the one category that is white people is simply unfair. It's immoral. And I'll let you respond, Steve, and then we'll get Matthew to jump in.
I'll try and keep my response quick, because I'm conscious that we want to bring Matthew in. But yeah, I think all of what you say is true. That it's natural and inevitable that people of the same ethnicity will pursue their ethnic interests. So it's muted in people of European ancestry for the moment, but it's starting to come up now because they can see their nations being transformed before their eyes in a very unwelcome way. So it's natural that they will start to, and inevitable that they will return to a very strong ethnic consciousness and more largely a sort of racial consciousness of themselves as Europeans. As an approach, though, in Australia, I think there's a sort of initial approach, and that is that what we need to distinguish between is there are Australian citizens and then there's the Australian ethnos. Now, they used to be the same thing, that is, that people of Australian ethnicity, that is, the descendants of people from the British Isles and Europe, that ethnicity, which is sometimes called White Australia, was synonymous with the nation, so they were the citizens. But obviously, after through the 1970s and on, where there's been large-scale immigration from China and in India and the Arab world and so on, that changes. So at the moment, I think it's a perfectly logical distinction to say there are Australian citizens who have legal rights. We all have those rights. But within that, there are all these different ethnic groups. One of those ethnic groups is White Australia, and we have our own interest. And the interest sometimes might align with another groups, sometimes not. But we just have to recognise that, Jewish Australians have an ethnic interest, white Australians have an ethnic interest, Greek Australians, Chinese, Arabs and others, Indian Australians, they all have their unique ethnic interest and what they perceive to be their destiny, which they're pursuing. And we're doing the same thing, and we have a right to do the same thing, and we are not going to stop doing that.
Exactly. Sorry, right. And we've got organisations like the British Australia community who are doing exactly that, standing up for the historical Australian And I want to pivot slightly. So we've discussed the inception of the Australian identity and outlined its decline, particularly in the late 20th century, around the end of the White Australia policy, the opening up of migration systems, and we've outlined what it is today. It's a toxic issue. There's, as John alluded to at the start, there's laws against saying certain things or certain symbols about white identity. What is the path forward for people like us who are, as you've pointed out, are perfectly reasonable in our desire to protect our ethnic groups' interests in Australia? What is the path forward, and what does it look like?
I'm very hopeful. I think it's an exciting time, actually, because there's a recovery, a rediscovery of wonderful elements of old Australia that we've kind of ignored, neglected, pushed to the wayside. And we need to start recognizing that if everyone's telling us we're in a multicultural society, we have a distinctive culture as well, and we can actually leverage that to our advantage. We have to do that. So I'm actually hopeful that there is a growing awareness that in some respects our interests are being attacked. We are certainly not using the significant resources we have as a people. We are still a majority. So we need to, as it were, encourage our people more generally to start taking an active role in movements like the ones you've mentioned. We need to be sensible. We need to make good distinctions, good philosophical and good moral distinctions of the kind I hope I've been making, so that people can see that our position is reasonable and moral. But in the end, we've got this wonderful tradition. Our people have a wonderful culture. It's unique in the world. It used to be celebrated. In my childhood, it was still celebrated. It was loved. When I first visited England in 1995, the English, they were a little bit disappointed. They thought it'd have a broader accent, and the people I was staying with, because it was an exchange program, I think they wanted someone a little bit more like Paul Hogan. But they got me. But all I felt was this great love for the distinctiveness of the Australian ethnicity. They talked about great Australian tennis players, the sort of knockabout way that we have. They loved the fact that, they love our cricketers, love hate, but they love someone like Shane Warne. What is it they love about Shane Warne? It's that he belongs to their group in a historical sense, but he's got this distinctive Australian larrikin thing, as well as being a sporting genius. But the blonde hair and the blue eyes and just this sense that we've got this unique sporting prowess. Once we start to talk about it, it's a little bit hard not to go towards cliches. But we have a wonderful high culture. We have a wonderful tradition of poetry, and poetry folk level and at the high level. We have some of the greatest poets in English in the 20th century. We have a wonderful system of laws, and you mentioned some of the problems. I mean, this is now we're seeing the effect of multiculturalism, unfortunately, that is affecting the freedoms that came with us and which really only survive with us as a supermajority. But I'm very hopeful.
Yeah, I think there's plenty of reason to be hopeful. We're seeing, I suppose, it's always been this way that conflict has caused the solution to emerge, and it's only been, I guess 60 years, less than 60 years since the White Australia policy was formally ended, and we're already seeing sort of, I'd say, although it's not nearly at critical mass, it's certainly a rising sentiment that people are reinvestigating this history, like you just said. And that sort of brings me my mind to the sort of conclusion of what I'd say was Australian ethnogenesis, which was the World Wars. So that
Yeah,
was about the time where we melded as a people, and that was really sort of the zenith of a united Australia. Because if you believe in something, if you love something, you have to fight for it. You have to defend it. You have to take action. And I think that although it's sort of a disconnected way because we were fighting in a European war for the mother country, for the UK, and also defending our own homeland from Japan and within the islands surrounding us. But we were, I say we, Australians were encouraged to go fight for white Australia in France. And although it may seem strange, I think that was when we became a people, when they lined up in their military uniforms and they saw that although they were very similar to all the other allies, they ways, even if minor. And that I guess that was sort of the conclusion of Australian ethnogenesis. And they returned, and you don't really have the sort of sectarianism that existed prior to World War One, after World War Two. It existed to some degree, but it was more of an undercurrent. And for example, when the topic became fighting communism, and that became a big focus within politics, you had that undercurrent of the Irish Catholics within Labour, and you had the sort of the Tories within Liberal, and they were a bit more Anglican and whatnot. That always existed, but it was so muted in comparison to, we've got one people, and though we have disagreements about economics, about our values, at the end of the day, it's a family dispute. We're all united by common heritage, which has been melded together through struggle, and we've fought for this land. It is ours, and I guess that's the sense that it appears within the literature. Sort of came over the land.
Yeah.
So yeah, maybe that's a little bit amorphous, but yeah, that's sort of what I see as the conclusion. If the beginning was the children that were conceived on the first fleet, I suppose the conclusion would have been World War Two. But although I would say the Australian people are still developing, I think we will, if we come out of, and well, maybe I should say when we come out of the other side of the multicultural crisis which afflicts us, I think we'll be such a strong people that we will never be afflicted by this same issue again. This is the second time it's come around. The first time it wasn't nearly as powerful a cultural wave, multiculturalism that is, prior to federation. This time around, if we are able to recognize ourselves as a people and we're able to throw off the weight of multiculturalism, it's hard to ever see us returning ever again. I think that we will be able to then reach on to further things. We'll be able to, terraform the outback, colonize the stars, and all the other projects which can come when you have a stable country, which isn't under threat from within, doesn't have domestic turmoil constantly.
Absolutely. I think you're right. Our destiny is in our own hands. And for the moment, and this is the opportunity, this is the time to seize it. And I think you're right about the First World War. And that's reflected in one of the great ages of Australian cinema, where you get this burgeoning kind of nationalism. It's kind of propelled from the left, really, in the 1970s. But you get these great films, Gallipoli, Picnic at Hanging Rock, and so on. They're both Peter Weir films, as it happens. But that film, Gallipoli, crystallizes what you're saying very, very well. It's a new people with a shared, yes, we have a shared history with our, brothers and sisters in Britain and in Ireland and in other parts of Europe, but we are a new people, and we've arrived. That's, I think, the feeling that you get from that film Gallipoli. It's in the 70s, but it's looking back, of course, to 1914, 15. And yeah, that's right. And, for me, it was a privilege, just when I look back, just to have grown up on a street, not with returned servicemen from World War One, but with soldiers who had fought in the Second World War. And one in particular, it was just a privilege to grow up with them. They were men on our street. Anzac Day would happen. You'd see them in the march. The War Memorial meant something. They'd come and talk at the school before Anzac Day. And there was a real sense that they had done this for us, and, obviously that we don't necessarily get that any longer, but that I just feel very privileged that I grew up at a time in the late 70s and 80s when we still had old soldiers around from World War II who were in their 60s and still able to talk lucidly about it all.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we're approaching the end of the episode, so I suppose we'll wrap up. I have one last thing to say. I guess I mentioned you mentioned, sorry, at the beginning of the episode that you're into poetry. But I suppose everything we were talking about in this episode was reflected in the poetry of its time, whether that was from I guess the early ballads, Botany Bay, all the way through to poems talking about how Australians have become one people. I think there's a poem where the refrain is "Unfurl the flag of the Southern Cross," and I believe that concludes by saying about how we've got our own flag now. It has been presented on the world stage, and we've become Australians. I'll have to dig it up. It may be Patterson, it may be Lawson, Henry Lawson, that is. But nonetheless, what you're saying is reflected all throughout our poetry. As you wrap up, I'll let you discuss a little bit about the significance of the poetry, maybe, and you can talk about why you feel that's important today, and then I'll let you give the audience your social media and everything like that.
Yeah, so you're right. I mean, we have the great balladists. We have the great folk tradition that, as you say, comes on the First Fleet. And Russell Ward talks about the chaunters, which was a phenomenon in England, that basically homeless men who were, living hand to mouth and would just be composing ballads and singing them in the street. People would like them, and then they'd be able to put them into a little folder and they'd get published and they'd start to earn a living. And that tradition carried over into the streets of the settlement, the early colony. And it's wonderful. So it's, we at school, when I was at primary school, we still learnt some of those. I mean, Bound for Botany Bay is an obvious one. But the tradition of Australian poetry really came into its own, I think, in the 20th century. And it's now at the level of what you might say high culture, although someone like Les Murray would have rejected that it was high culture. It was both high and middle and folk and everything. But there are poets, recent poets that I think Australians should read. Les Murray is one. Robert Gray is our greatest landscape poet. And Philip Hodgins, who's a poet who died in 1995 at the age of 36 of leukemia, has just written some of the great masterpieces of Australian poetry. So they're three poets that I'd recommend to viewers. My socials, I probably should know my Twitter, what it is, but you can find me on Twitter. If you're in the business world, you can find me on LinkedIn. And the website where you can find my profile is at Campion. It's campion.edu.au.
Yeah, I'll put all those links down below. Matthew, you want to take us away?
Yeah, subscribe to us on all your podcasting apps, rate us, share us to anyone who you think might benefit from listening to us, and as always, have a lovely week and good night, everyone.
Yeah, thank you everyone for listening. Have a great rest of your week. And thank you for joining us, Stephen.
Thanks for having me, John and Matthew. It's been great to join you.